Hi again. In this video, we're going to be talking about 6/4 chords, kind of continuing our discussion of prolongation. In the previous videos, we've talked about tonic function and how to prolong the tonic. We've talked about dominant function and cadences, and we've also talked about predominant function. So we're going to be talking quite a bit more about prolongation today through 6/4 chords, which, as we're going to find out, tend to be used in prolongations. So first off, a little overview of 6/4 chords. Now, as we learned in species counterpoint, classical composers consider the fourth above the bass to be a dissonance. So if you had this happen, even though if I just play that outside of a context, that sounds stable. If it's occurring above the bass, they consider that to be a dissonance. Therefore, 6/4 chords, which of course do contain a fourth above the bass, are treated carefully by classical composers. They are not used freely as substitutes for chords with the same root. You can't just kind of wildly throw in 6/4 chords. Therefore, 6/4 chords, number 2, are always used to prolong another harmony. And further, number 3, they tend to fall into 3 basic categories, and these categories have something to do about how they're going to be used in progressions. One category is the pedal or neighbor 6/4. Another one is the passing. And then finally, probably the best known of all is the cadential 6/4. Now, before we get into these, just one quick voice leading rule for all of them. Number 4, always double the bass for all of these 6/4 chord types. Now, you'll find out why that is. It has to do with the prolongation, essentially, and also the voice leading patterns that are being used. All right, let's go ahead and get into, again, we're now going to talk about the 3 types. And let's start with the pedal or neighbor 6/4 chord. Of course, have your handout with you as you're doing this. Now, this chord, the reason it goes by 2 names is going to be because basically the voice leading is going to have both of these components. But this chord is going to occur at a weak metrical position. So it could be a beat 2, for example, of a 4/4 measure, or it could be even a weak measure. Like if you had a 4-bar pattern, you had one chord in measure 1, you might have measure 2 could be where this chord happens. So just a weak metrical position in general. And it's going to occur in between the chord being prolonged. And it's going to create 2 neighbor note motions in the upper voices. So the intervals above the bass will be 5/3, 6/4, 5/3. It's basically a complete upper neighbor going to be happening in 2 different voices, while the bass is held as a pedal. All right, so let's take a look at this first one, for example. You'll notice that this one is prolonging the 1 chord. So we have these 2 neighbor note motions, E, G, F, A, E, G, and then otherwise we're kind of holding this pedal. So you can see why it's useful to have this for 2 different, or have 2 different terms for this one. Anyhow, number 3, the 2 most common examples of this are the neighbor 4/6/4. This is the first one I have here. You can use a 4/6/4 to prolong the tonic harmony. And you can, almost like the 4 chord almost happens, you barely even hear that it's a 4 chord. It depends on the situation, but you barely even get the sense of a 4 chord at all. Just hear the neighbor note motions. And then also you'll sometimes find a neighbor or pedal 1/6/4. This is the second one I have, where it prolongs the dominant. So if we're in the key of C major here, notice how I doubled the G, right? Double the bass always for these. And then here I have the 2. So here's my chord, the 5 chord. I voiced it a little different there so you could see something different. All right, so neighbor or pedal 6/4 looks like this. Very straightforward. I double the bass. I create a couple of neighbor note motions with the 3rd and the 5th going up and then down. And there you have it. Let me put this down and play you both of these again. Here's the neighbor 4/6/4. And here is the neighbor 1/6/4. Sorry. You'll find, especially with the neighbor 164, you'll find a little more freedom in actual music and how this is treated. But it's pretty common that you'll encounter like a long dominant prolongation towards the end of a section, where you'll get like a 1 chord happening above the pedal. That's also kind of an example of this. And in that case, you might not get the neighbor note motions, but you will get this sort of sense that the 5 chord is, you will definitely get the pedal, even in that case. All right, let's move on to our next type. Next type is the passing 6/4 chord. This one's also going to occur at a weak metrical position, and the bass is going to create a passing motion between 2 chords of the same function. You know, a passing motion, that's going to be a stepwise motion that passes in between a third, the space of a third. So basically, just like we learned in the lesson about tonic prolongation. In part writing these ones, number 2, you're going to create a voice exchange between the bass and one of the upper voices. Now, this first one we already covered actually in the lecture on tonic prolongation. But notice how I create, here I have a passing 5/6/4 between 1 and 1/6. So the bass passes, and notice how I create this voice exchange. That's where we get the doubling there, is from the voice exchange. And this is one option here, which is the passing 5/6/4, and that's creating a tonic prolongation. Let me play that one for you. Now, the other one that's not mentioned as much in many textbooks is I can also use, this is the second option, I can also use a passing 1/6/4. In a passing 1/6/4, you're going to have scale degree 5 in the bass, and it's going to pass in between scale degrees 6 and 4. And therefore, it's actually going to prolong the predominant. In this case, I used a 4/6/4 and a 2/6. That's the ones I tend to find a lot. You'll also find this occurring when you have some chromatic chords like secondary dominants of 5. You'll find like a passing 1/6/4 in between. But notice I still got a little voice exchange here. So the bass went A, G, F, I went F, G, A, and I created that passing 1/6/4 in between. Of course, be careful when you do this that you don't create any parallels. All right, so imagine, I'll play the second one. This is the main key, and you encounter something like this. All right, that will be your predominant prolongation, which then, of course, we go into 5 and to 1. All right, so that's the passing 6/4. Again, notice how these always create prolongations. And this one, just like the pedal, where it occurs on a weak beat. So it's kind of a weak metrical position. All right, finally, the best known of all of the 6/4 chord types, and the most controversial, at least from a labeling standpoint, is the cadential 6/4. Now, unlike the other two, this one's going to occur at a strong metrical position, and it's going to create this sense of accented dissonances. Now, very important, the cadential 6/4 prolongs the 5 chord, so it's going to be a dominant prolongation. Here it is right here, the second or the first full measure that you see here is the cadential 6/4. And it does so basically, instead of going straight from this predominant chord to 5, I'm going to basically delay the 5th and the 3rd by having the 6th and the 4th move down to the 5th and the 3rd. And therefore I just kind of delay the voice leading motion. Now, number 3, here's the labeling weirdness about this. Though the cadential 6/4 happens to have the notes of a 1/6/4 chord, we are going to label this chord 5/6/4 to 5/3. Now notice the little lines here. Those show voice leading motions above the 5 chord. So what you don't want to make a mistake here is when you see this Roman numeral, do not interpret it to mean that the cadential 6/4 is a 5 chord in second inversion. In other words, it's not a 5/6/4 chord. It's a 5 root position chord with delayed notes. Very, very important. So don't write, don't look at this Roman numeral here and go and write this 5, 6, 4 there. These are completely different notes, because this here is actually a 5 chord with delayed. Basically, think about the E and the C here as non-chord tones. You'll see one usefulness of or a reason that this is quite useful is I chose my predominant chord carefully here, because usually if I went 2, 6 straight to 5, I'd have a re to T soprano. I'd have that gap. The cadential 6/4 allows you to fill in that gap. So instead of going straight from re to T, I can fill it in with this accented passing tone, essentially. All right. And now, then lastly, before I do play this for you, there's another variant of this that I've written over in the corner. This is when you also have the 7th, when you have the octave go down to the 7th. And this is what it looks like. You write 5, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. So the only difference between this one and this one is I moved the G down as well to the F. So 8 to 7th, and then the other motions as well. Let me play with the sounds. No, definitely get used to this one. Almost every classical piece has multiple examples of the cadential 6/4. All right, so predominant chord, and then, all right, see how that's really just a sound of a 5 chord. And then the second one, I can just do the same thing, but add the 7th in there. All right, so there we go. Let's go on and now take a look at some of our exercises for this lesson. Basically, I have 2 things I want you to work on, and then you can pause the video, and then we'll take a look at what you did. First one's an analysis example. Be on the lookout for some 6/4 chords and do 2 levels of analysis. Don't worry about analyzing the things I put in boxes. Try to just ignore those for now. And don't forget to do the second level of analysis. And then I also want you to work on a figured bass. This is an A minor. Also include 2 levels of Roman numerals below the figures. And I'd recommend starting on scale degree 3 in the soprano. All right, so make sure you voice these all correctly according to the models on the handout. All right, why don't you go ahead and pause the video now, and I'll show you my answers once you've had time to look at it. Okay, here we go. Let me see if I can get in enough that you can clearly see it. Don't worry too much about the first 4 measures. I'm mostly interested, this is a parallel period, so you're gonna get the same thing for both of these phrases. I'm mostly interested in what happens in the last 4 measures of each of these. I haven't rewritten this just happens in an octave higher. I haven't rewritten what happened, this is just a repeat. All right, but let's take a look here. We'll see we get a whole bunch of 6/4 chord types here. First off, this is measure 5. We get the passing 6/4. Notice how the bass goes me, re, do, and the soprano goes do, re, mi. We get that voice exchange, so that's obviously a tonic prolongation. Notice the long tonic prolongation here. Then it goes to a neighbor 5/6/4 chord and so on. Now then here, if you follow by not analyzing the notes I put in boxes, you now get here a dominant prolongation, and this is the pedal 6/4. So if you ignore the notes in the boxes, you'll see that basically we get pedals here, and then the upper 2 voices, the 5th and the 3rd, move up by step and then down. So that would be a pedal 6/4. Now then in the last phrase, we get the cadential 6/4. And this is the one where you also get the 7th here. All right, let me play you this right here. Just talk you through it a little bit. So 1, 6. Don't worry about this chord right now. Now here we get the passing 6/4. All right. Then we get a little neighbor chord here to 1, and then we get the pedal 6/4, prolonging the 5. So essentially, boxes. Then second phrase starts out the same. Sorry. But then the ending, cadential 6/4. So notice in that one, you have the accented dissonances on the downbeat. Now, one curious thing about this example is that you'll see there's actually no predominant function at all in this particular piece. That does happen sometimes. Clearly, you would have had a little more dynamism if we had had a predominant function, but I think there's plenty of interest at the beginning, that's for sure. All right, now that we've looked at that, so we see basically lots of prolongations. Every time that I got a 6/4 chord, there's some sort of prolongation happening. Tonic prolongation, and then dominant prolongations at the cadences. All right, let's go down now to, now this is just my, though to be honest, really the way I voiced it, if you put the scuddery 3 in the soprano like I recommended, you probably got something very similar to this. So I start off here with the neighbor 6/4. Make sure that you double the A and that you move the upper voices up by step and then back down. Then I got the passing 6/4. So the passing 5/6/4, the bass goes do, re, mi. And I did the soprano, mi, re, do. I got a voice exchange there. And you'll naturally get the doubled bass if you do that. Then there's various things you could have done in this next little bit. Now just be a little careful. One thing you want to look at when you go from the 1/6 to the 2 diminished 6, be careful that you didn't create any parallel octaves or parallel fifths. Notice that I doubled the note D. Remember how you're supposed to double the bass of your predominant chords with fa in the bass? And then I put the cadential 6/4 at the ending. Make sure that you double the note E. Make sure that when you went from your 2/6 to 5, that all the voices moved in contrary motion, right? That's the basic. Anytime you have fa to sol in the bass, predominant to dominant, you're going to have that contrary motion moving against the upper voices. Now, in this case, I did get a very boring alto line, but that's because there's so much tonic prolongation. I forgot to mention, by the way, with the cadential 6/4, it's very common for the bass, when it's sustaining scuddery 5, to leap down an octave. That's a kind of common little trope that you're going to be looking for a lot of times with the cadential 6/4. All right, let me see if I can play this for you. At this point, we're getting a lot more variety into our progressions. We have many more chords. We have a whole variety of ways to prolong things now. And this is going to be sort of our backbone for so many things that we're going to be doing.